The blonde girl woke up in terror, gasping for air, and found herself kneeling on the sand of a tropical beach, both surprised and shocked by the nature of this place. She looked around in shock, unable to comprehend why she was amidst water and sand. Staring at the towering mountains and breathtaking natural scenery before her, she realized her life was a series of bad timings. Her memory returned to where it all began, a day of torrential rain when she picked up a dropped cultivation novel on the street. Her previous life ended in a tragic car accident while she was reading that novel, her passion for reading more important to her than surviving in reality. The plot of the novel she was reading revolved around a great saintess and 5 male leads, who suddenly woke up to find themselves trapped on a deserted island. The author described in precise and vivid detail their year-long struggle for survival on this magically cursed island, like a true survival story. But this novel was not just an adventure story. It was a highly rated, dark romance novel with adult content. The girl recalled the bold descriptions in the novel, burying her face in her palms and despairing at the fate that awaited her. She realized a shocking truth. She had not been reincarnated as the female lead, but as the villainess, Margaret. Margaret Rose Flawn, the second daughter of the Duke of the Langrid Empire. This villainess burned with rage, jealous of the female lead who had stolen the affection of the male leads, her malice and jealousy reaching the point of attempting to murder the heroine, pushing her off a towering cliff. In the end, after playing the villain throughout the story, she met a gruesome death at the hands of the male leads who had descended into madness. Amidst these thoughts, she felt a sharp headache, Margaret's memories overlapping with her own and adding to her confusion. She touched her face and looked at her clothes, confirming that she had indeed transmigrated into the body of the villainess in the novel's world. She wondered in horror if any of this was real, standing straight in her magnificent blue dress and letting the wind tousle her hair, deciding she urgently needed to find a safe place to hide. Her goal was to survive until the portal allowing escape from the island opened a year later. She realized she had to avoid meeting Crown Prince Enoch and secretly vowed to be cautious. While all the male leads disliked Margaret's personality, he loathed and despised her more than anyone, making him her greatest threat. Margaret remembered the first male lead of the novel, the Crown Prince of the Langrid Empire, Enoch Asterklaus Langrid, possessing an overwhelming aura and sharp features. Margaret wondered in surprise why he was here. He looked to be in bad shape, drenched in sweat, and Margaret grumbled, expressing her indignation at the miserable situation she was in. Margaret panicked upon seeing him, realizing the difficulty of survival had multiplied insanely due to his presence. She quickly grasped that where she was now was the true starting point of the novel's plot, and Enoch, with a faint groan, began to slowly open his eyes. Margaret realized this was no time to be dazed. She had to escape from here immediately before he fully regained consciousness. She looked around for an exit, and finding her path blocked by the sea on one side, she decided to head to the forest on the other side as a temporary shelter. But before she could get far, a strong hand shot out and grabbed her foot, causing her to fall to the ground, screaming in surprise and pain. Enoch looked down at her, his eyes flashing with anger, and asked in a threatening tone if she thought she could escape from him, reminding her of a vague past conversation. He trapped her with his body, rendering her immobile, and repeatedly asked her destination. Margaret screamed internally for salvation, cursing the terrible timing that brought her face to face with him. Enoch pressed down hard on her chin, causing her pain, and demanded she explain what had happened. From his proximity and accusing gaze, Margaret realized he thought she had kidnapped him and brought him to this island. She was filled with regret, regretting that she hadn't run away the moment she opened her eyes, but had instead tried to assess the situation. She mumbled incoherently, unable to form a complete sentence. To distract him, Margaret desperately pointed behind him and screamed, asking what that was. Enoch looked back for a second, and she seized the opportunity to try and crawl away, but he immediately saw through the trick as there was nothing there. He returned to grab her again, angrily asking if she thought this situation was a joke. He stared at her with a cold gaze, ordering her to give a convincing explanation immediately. Margaret, with a sincerity born of fear, shouted at him, insisting she knew nothing and was just as confused as he was. His face drew close to hers, mocking her claim of innocence and asking how she could expect him to believe her. Margaret admitted internally that given the original Margaret's history with him, his suspicion of her was completely justified. In the past, Margaret was known for obsessively pursuing Enoch like a stalker. After being deceived, she even offered him a love potion, but the potion caused him to have a fatal allergic reaction. That incident brought him to the brink of death. From then on, Enoch began to harbor a true and deep hatred for Margaret. Despite all the problems she caused and her unintentional attempt to kill him, she received no punishment due to the protection of the powerful Duchy of Flan. To make matters worse, Crown Prince Enoch was the son of a commoner made with no powerful backing to protect him, which made his position weak against the influence of her family. Margaret now realized she had no real defense, feeling completely powerless, but she tried to defend herself with logic, assuring him it was just a misunderstanding and that no matter how influential the Flan family was, recklessly kidnapping the Crown Prince of the Empire was illogical. Enoch analyzed the situation with a strategic mind, suggesting that everything that had happened might be a conspiracy orchestrated by the Rodban faction. Rodban was the former Crown Prince, exiled to the north after Enoch took his position, which pointed suspicion towards a motive of revenge. As he delved into thoughts of political intrigue, he became more convinced that their presence here was no coincidence, but a calculated political move. Margaret sharply interrupted him, pointing out that deep thinking could be postponed until after their survival was secured, and tried to leave, declaring she would go her own way. But Enoch suddenly grabbed her hand, stopping her from leaving. She pleaded with him with an anxious expression to let go, so he shot her a sharp, dark glare, warning her not to try to run away again, and asserting that he would not allow it. Margaret flinched from his tight grip, but he coldly reprimanded her, telling her to stop overacting. Enoch laid out his plan of action, explaining that the first priority was to determine their location and that climbing to the mountain peak to survey the terrain was the best option. He explained his logic, saying that if they were inland, they wouldn't see the horizon, but if they were on an island, the sea would surround them. Margaret hesitated, looking at the sky and noticing the sun was already low and time was running out. She retrieved information from the original novel from her memory. On this magical island, it became extremely dangerous after sunset due to the appearance of predatory monsters. Images of wolves and beasts flashed through her mind, and she realized they had to act quickly before darkness fell. Margaret wisely decided to postpone the mountain climb until tomorrow, as darkness could strike during the climb, posing a great danger. He expressed surprise at Margaret's rational thinking, which he was not used to, so she wondered to herself whether it was a compliment or an insult. Enoch confirmed her plan to find a hiding place now and explore the surroundings, postponing the climb until tomorrow. Margaret quickly admired his intuition and quick judgment, qualities expected of someone who had lived on the battlefield and earned the title of Crown Prince through merit, though she knew in advance that he would soon become madly obsessed with the female lead. Suddenly, Margaret remembered an important detail about the novel's unique world building. Modern items were scattered across the island. These items included first aid kits, shoes, and ointments, hidden in remote places. In the original story, the characters discarded these tools because they didn't know how to use them, and she imagined Enoch looking at a first aid kit in confusion. She wondered why the author had placed these things, but she realized her only advantage. She was the only one who could use these tools effectively, unlike the other characters. Margaret decided to stick with Enoch for the time being, until she found the cabin where the novel's male leads were hiding. Enoch shot her a sharp look, warning her not to think about running away again. She feigned surrender and quickly agreed, raising her hands, realizing he was too sharp and had sensed her intentions. She consoled herself that dealing with one man who utterly despised her was better than facing a group of men who hated her. As Enoch wielded a sharp wooden stick, skillfully and powerfully cutting through the dense vegetation in front of them, Margaret suddenly gasped in surprise. He examined the makeshift weapon with satisfaction, deeming it decent for self-defense. He turned to Margaret, who stood frozen in surprise, and coldly asked if the stick was suitable, then ordered her to move. Margaret noted with concern that the sun was already setting, heralding danger, and since the end of the beach was blocked by rocky cliffs, the two were forced to venture into the forest in search of safety before nightfall. Enoch urged Margaret to hurry, stressing the need to get out of there before night fell completely, while she called out to him in an uneasy tone. She looked around anxiously, suggesting it would be safer to return to where they first woke up, but suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a terrifying howl echoing around them, making them realize with horror that there were wolves nearby. Margaret looked up and glimpsed a wolf standing on top of a rock, and, unable to believe her eyes, she let out a scream. The wolf quickly lunged at them, while a glaring question flashed through Margaret's mind. The monsters in the novel only appeared at night, so why were they attacking now before the sun had even set? The beast charged at her with its jaws wide open, and she let out a scream of terror. At the decisive moment, Enoch intervened, pulling her towards him to protect her and preparing to face it with a wooden stick in his hand. With a swift and powerful blow, he dealt a fatal strike to the attacking beast with a wooden stick. Margaret was stunned by the scene because Enoch had killed the monster in a single blow with just a tree branch. She stared in shock at the wooden spear embedded in the wolf's body, looking at him with admiration and admitting to herself that such an outstanding performance was indeed fitting for the novel's male lead. But Enoch turned to her, his gaze sharp and cold, a strange light glinting in his eyes, causing her to shrink back in fear as she remembered he had a psychological trauma related to blood. Suddenly, without warning, he pushed her away, and she fell to the ground. Confused by his sudden action, she told herself she couldn't even take care of herself, let alone worry about his behavior. But when she saw another wolf appear where she had just been standing, she immediately understood the reason, wondering in horror why monsters were appearing even in the sunlight. She recalled the text of the original novel, something more important than survival, which clearly stated that monsters were only active at night. She realized the terrifying truth. The condition was not night as in the time of day, but darkness as in the environment, and it was already dark inside the forest. She came to a conclusion. As long as there was darkness, the monsters would move, and nighttime was simply when the darkness lasted the longest and monster activity peaked. She clutched her clothes tightly, overcome by the fear that she might die before finding a safe cabin. Enoch noticed her body trembling from extreme fear, thinking to himself that this kind of terrifying situation must be a first for a noble lady like her. He asked in a calm tone if she was okay, as she seemed to have lost consciousness from shock, unaware of what creature had attacked them. He reached out and gently touched her face, explaining that he was asking because she was pale and looked like she was about to die. Margaret was surprised by the drastic change in his behavior, from treating her coldly and pushing her away to now asking with concern. She wondered to herself if seeing her in such a weak state reminded him of his past injured comrades. She regained her balance and told him in a trembling voice that she was fine and gratefully thanked him for saving her life. He let out a sigh of relief, but quickly returned to his stern mask, reminding her that she was still a suspect and that he would interrogate her properly once they returned to the Empire. He gave a strict order in a commanding tone, saying she was forbidden to die without his permission. Margaret felt wronged and indignant at the thought of being interrogated when she had done nothing, but he interrupted her thoughts by holding out his hand and ordering her to hurry and grab it. As it was dangerous here, she took his hand, and despite her annoyance at his attitude, she found a great sense of security in his cold on the outside, warm on the inside, Sundara-like strength and actions. Finally, they emerged from the dense, dark forest into a brighter, open area by the beach, allowing her to catch her breath and let out a long sigh. Through their combined efforts, the two finally finished building a temporary shelter. Enoch was in charge of gathering branches, pebbles, and large leaves, while Margaret collected moss from the forest. Enoch invited her to come in and sit, and Margaret was surprised by his ability to show kindness and courtesy even as someone he disliked, praising his moral character as ideal as ever. But he quickly drew a line between them, warning her not to get too close and to maintain a safe distance, coldly explaining that he had no intention of sleeping next to her. Margaret silently retorted that the feeling was mutual. She asked how she could feel at ease about what he might do, and he shot her a look full of anger for not using honorifics with him. Margaret, with an anxious smile, addressed him by his formal title, trying to ease the tension. They fell asleep together in the narrow shelter, enveloped by the cold and an awkward silence. Margaret broke the silence by asking if he was thirsty. Enoch sighed in his sleep, so she pointed out that they hadn't had a single drop of water since arriving on the island, and Enoch suggestively warned her not to think about running away. Margaret explained seriously that staying in this state could lead them to collapse from dehydration and even die before returning to the Empire. Enoch jumped up, warning her not to test his patience. So Margaret immediately proposed to go find coconuts or anything similar for hydration, promising to be back soon. She set off into the forest, and he questioned her about the appearance of coconuts in this world until she found the round, brown fruit and joyfully confirmed it to him at once. She eagerly explained to him that it was a fruit that grew on palm trees and contained an excellent hydrating liquid. Margaret carefully inspected the fruit, noting that this one looked good and warning him not to eat overripe ones as they could cause diarrhea and worsen dehydration. Enoch moved swiftly, pressing the hard fruit with both hands and splitting it in half with astonishing strength, leaving Margaret amazed. He held out his hand, offering her one of the split halves. She took it from his hand, thanking him, still shocked by his immense physical strength. Margaret assured him she had checked the fruit and that he could drink it now, while Enoch watched her with a scrutinizing and deep gaze. As she drank, Enoch began to analyze her character, noticing that the Margaret he had seen all day was completely different from the one he thought he knew. He recalled her former image as an arrogant ducal lady and found her current behavior to be the complete opposite. He wondered in confusion how a duke's daughter who indulged in the luxuries of aristocratic life would know how to build a primitive bed and distinguish edible fruits. His doubts grew as he watched her, seriously questioning if this girl was really the person he knew. Margaret interrupted his thoughts by offering him the fruit, and he once again noted the vast difference in her behavior, telling Margaret she had become a completely different person. She noticed his suspicious gaze and nervously tried to justify herself, saying that people naturally change in extreme circumstances. Margaret thought to herself that she was still under suspicion and he would formally interrogate her once they returned to the Empire, so she secretly decided to continue her denial for now. Margaret worried that any attempt to explain she wasn't the real Margaret could lead to a greater misunderstanding, making him think she was the mastermind behind this whole disaster. Enoch commented faintly that a complete change was a rare phenomenon. He corrected himself, saying that seeing her sound judgment and how she handled the situation, it seemed possible. He ended the conversation with a look of cautious appreciation, noting that an ordinary lady would not be able to maintain such composure in such a difficult situation. Margaret entered the small shelter they had built and breathed a sigh of relief, thanking God for safely getting through that crisis. But the peace didn't last long, as she realized the extreme narrowness of the space as soon as she lay down, for she could clearly hear Enoch's breathing beside her. She found herself forced to sleep pressed against his back in an extremely awkward position, wondering indignantly how it was possible to sleep like this. As they tried to sleep, Margaret recalled the details of the confrontation with the wolf, realizing the creature was no ordinary animal. Enoch commented that the wolf exuded a sinister and dark aura, perfectly consistent with that of a demonic beast. He tried to test his power, only to be shocked to find that his sword aura did not respond and could not be activated, confirming Margaret's worst fears. She remembered the truth about this cursed island. It was a place where neither magic nor divine power worked, with both magic and religious symbols shown bound in chains, meaning everyone was stripped of their supernatural powers. She realized they had to survive with their bare hands, and despite the terrifying situation, remembering the brute force Enoch displayed when he killed the beast with a wooden stick gave her some comfort. Enoch interrupted her thoughts with a rude comment, expressing his annoyance at having to explain these things to a lady like her, which stirred her resentment towards his tone. He shot her another suspicious look, wondering why it was him and her, of all people, who had ended up in this place, which was too strange and suspicious. Margaret defended herself with clear logic, stating that if she had planned to kidnap him, she wouldn't have brought His Highness to this dangerous wilderness, but would have locked him in an isolated palace. As he shot her a sharp look, she stammered, denying she had any such intentions in the first place. Margaret changed the subject, asking what he was doing before coming here. Enoch clarified his situation, saying he had been buried in office work during that time, and she asked if he had noticed any suspicious people recently. Enoch felt as if he was undergoing a formal interrogation, a point confirmed when he looked at her coldly. He continued to explain that due to the busy annual report season, he hadn't left the palace for a month, which negated his contact with the outside world. Margaret looked at him with a sympathetic gaze, calling him a poor workaholic, before he suddenly caught her off guard by questioning her activities before the incident. She remembered the embarrassing truth. She had been in her own palace, fawning over a photo of him she had managed to obtain. Realizing it was impossible to tell the truth, she fabricated a quick lie, claiming she was enjoying afternoon tea time in her family's palace salon. Enoch looked at her suspiciously, while she admitted she couldn't narrow down the suspects because she was a social butterfly who met many people due to her status. Enoch finally decided it was too early to draw conclusions, and Margaret declared the interrogation over. She suggested they conserve their energy and try to sleep. Now they planned to climb the mountain tomorrow to scout their location, and Margaret, looking tired, complained to Enoch about the heat before sleeping. Enoch drew a dividing line on the ground, threatening to throw her into the sea if she crossed it, to which she retorted that she wouldn't cross it even if he paid her. Margaret began to analyze the situation, recalling the characters currently on the island. The captain of the Imperial Guard, the Crown Prince of the Hestia Kingdom, the High Saintess, the Archbishop, and the Archmage. She realized all the important figures of the Empire were gathered here, meaning the target wasn't just Enoch alone. She remembered a detail from the novel that everyone was supposed to wake up in scattered locations on the map. In the original story, Enoch was supposed to meet the female lead, Anna, while arguing with Margaret on the beach. She was surprised to realize that the novel's plot had deviated from its course from the very beginning. But the major disaster that suddenly struck and made her scream internally was that she had stopped reading the novel midway through the plot, meaning she was clueless about the rest of the story and their fate. Margaret realized that the novel's plot had indeed deviated from its original path, making the cabin that served as a safe haven in the story now a place of uncertain safety. However, she planned that if she found the cabin, she would gather the necessary supplies hidden there, such as sneakers, clothes, and ropes, and then begin searching for the secret bunker the female lead had discovered to hide in. She recalled the plot of the first volume, where the female lead, Anna, discovered an underground bunker next to the cabin. The protagonist in the original novel left the island through a portal and never touched it. Margaret hoped deep down that everything that had happened was just a long dream, and that when she opened her eyes tomorrow morning, she would find herself lying in her comfortable bed. She lamented that if this was reality, it was a shame she hadn't had the chance to see her favorite character, the Archmage Kaden, in person. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, a silver-haired man woke up, clutching his head in pain, wondering in surprise where he was, as if in response to his name being mentioned. The next morning came, and Margaret woke up to the regrettable discovery that this was not a dream, but a harsh reality. She felt her limbs were cold, realizing she had nearly frozen to death last night. She firmly decided that from now on, she must make sure to build a fire before sleeping to ensure warmth. Suddenly, she felt something heavy on her shoulder and turned to find it was Enoch's coat. She turned to find Enoch already awake and greeted him with his formal title, surprised that he was up so early. She noticed the dark circles around his eyes from fatigue and was shocked to realize he hadn't slept a wink all night, keeping watch. So she nagged at him, pointing out they didn't know how long they would be trapped here without food, scolding him for wasting calories, and reminding him they had to climb to the summit today. Enoch interrupted her with a serious tone, explaining to her that he had not yet decided if she was a trustworthy person. Margaret listened to his harsh words, yet pondered the stark contradiction between his words and actions. He said he didn't trust her, yet he had taken off his coat to cover her while she slept. With a hint of a sarcastic smile, she told herself she had never seen someone whose words and actions were so inconsistent in her life. The sound of her stomach growling broke the tension, so she shyly suggested they fill their stomachs with coconuts before the climb, to which Enoch reluctantly agreed. After an arduous trek, they reached the summit, confirming their fears. The sea surrounded them on all sides, leaving no doubt they were trapped on an isolated island. Margaret sadly realized that this scene confirmed she was indeed in that highly rated angsty, tragic novel she had read. Enoch angrily punched a rock, cursing this fate, and asked with suppressed rage why it had to be an island. In a state of collapse and losing control, he ran his hands through his hair, screaming and questioning who had sent them to this hell. Margaret watched him in shock, as she had never seen the powerful Crown Prince Enoch act so defeated and broken. Margaret realized the situation was just as bleak and desolate for her as it was for him. She remembered that the dimensional portal wouldn't open for a whole year, and wondered in horror if she had what it took to survive for so long among these male leads who were destined to go mad. She decided she had to find a chance to escape as soon as possible before Enoch lost his mind. But she noticed he had exhausted all his strength while climbing the mountain. She watched his deteriorating condition with concern. His face was pale, and his steps were faltering, and she realized it was dangerous to leave him in such a miserable state. Margaret recalled her past life as a deputy scout leader, and her responsible nature overcame her desire to escape. She decided to postpone her escape plan for the time being and set a new priority, taking measures to ensure their mutual survival. She reached out to Enoch, who looked on the verge of collapse, and after confirming the nature of the place, she firmly and calmly suggested they head down the mountain now. She looked into his eyes with a gaze full of challenge and hope, announcing her determination. They would overcome this predicament together and survive, then return home safely. Enoch looked at her in surprise. Even a battle-hardened warrior like him had been unable to sleep and had expended a great deal of energy, yet this noble lady appeared remarkably composed. Margaret realized that the exhausted Enoch was in no state to make sound judgments, so she decided to take the initiative herself. She reached out and firmly grasped his hand, a surprisingly bold move that startled him, while she seriously urged him to start down the mountain immediately before the monsters began to appear. As she pulled him along behind her, Enoch silently watched her hand holding his, filled with astonishment. After a moment of silence, he whispered a faint but sincere thank you for her intervention. But suddenly, a loud and sharp stomach growl broke the silence of the moment, completely shattering the serious atmosphere. Margaret's face turned beet red with extreme embarrassment, while Enoch stared in shock at the source of the sound, trying to comprehend what he had just heard. Enoch commented with a hint of a smile that climbing the mountain had indeed drained their energy and suggested they fill their stomachs as soon as they got down. When they reached the beach, Enoch curiously asked if she really intended to catch fish. Margaret replied with confidence and enthusiasm, asking him to trust her just this once and without any warning. Margaret boldly lifted her ornate dress, revealing her legs to wade into the water. Enoch, flustered and extremely embarrassed, quickly turned his face away, while she innocently asked him to start a fire before she was done. Enoch stood with his back to her, his face burning red, and Margaret wondered at his exaggerated reaction. She muttered to herself in confusion, wondering if this was the first time he had ever seen a woman's legs to make him act so abnormally. Margaret asked him if he knew how to start a fire, and he regained his composure and confirmed his military experience from when he was separated from his unit during the Battle of Romalison. She grabbed a wooden stick, leaving him to the task while she headed towards the sea. Margaret recalled information from the novel, remembering that aside from the wolf-like monsters and giant reptiles, the other animals on the island were completely normal. She watched the fish swimming in the clear water, certain they were just ordinary animals, and were edible. She resolved to hunt, realizing that coconuts alone were not enough to satisfy their hunger and provide the necessary energy. She held the wooden spear in a fighting stance, determined to get real nutrients from meat. Although she spoke with confidence, she admitted to herself that this was her first time trying to fish in the sea and anxiously wondered if she would succeed. She tried to comfort herself with her previous experience of spearfishing in rivers, even though the environment was completely different. She began to execute her strategy. The first step was to find crevices between the rocks where seawater collected and didn't flow out. She explained the reasoning to herself. The waves would push small fish into these crevices, trapping them by the rocks. She moved on to the second step, crushing the small fish trapped in the rocks, and then scattering their remains into the sea as bait to attract larger fish. Margaret stood in the waves, highly focused, holding her breath as she waited for the right moment. Suddenly, with lightning speed, she powerfully thrust the spear into the water. She raised the spear triumphantly, finding a large fish struggling on its tip, and let out an ecstatic scream at her success. She proudly praised herself, wondering if she was a genius for succeeding on her first try. As she stood tall in the sunlight, she realized that the tough camping days she had spent in her past life in Korea had made her surprisingly well adapted to life in the wild. As Margaret stood in the waves, a great sense of happiness and accomplishment washed over her, and although she was no global survival expert, she felt immense pride in her fishing success. Enoch watched her from the beach, his face filled with astonishment, unable to believe the skill he was witnessing from the noblewoman. Margaret noticed he had been staring and secretly wondered just how long he had been watching in silence. Margaret recalled her successful strategy, first throwing a rock to stun the fish, then finishing it off with a precise spear thrust, but she decided to omit these details in front of Enoch, choosing to appear more modest. As Enoch sat by the fire grilling the fish, he frankly expressed his admiration for her skills, admitting he hadn't expected her to also know how to clean and prepare the fish for cooking. Margaret downplayed it in her mind, thinking that anyone who enjoyed fishing could do it. Suddenly, she remembered the direction of the original novel, and her hands paused. In the real story, the heroine would usually just sit and accept the fish that Enoch caught and grilled for her. But here, she was hunting and preparing food like a wild bear, even serving Enoch herself, completely reversing the situation. As she handed him the grilled fish, she felt the strangeness of the situation, realizing she had voluntarily taken on the hard labor. She stared at Enoch with a strange and intense gaze, making him nervous and confused, as he didn't understand the reason for her look. When he questioned her, she turned her face away without a word, just staring at the fish grilling over the fire. Suddenly, his body moved unexpectedly close to her, causing her to freeze in place. Her eyes widened in shock, and her heart raced due to his extreme proximity. But he simply reached out and patted her head, coolly explaining that he was watching her because the scene was amusing, and assured her that he would handle it next time. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief, awkwardly placing a hand on her face, realizing she had almost misunderstood the situation and thought it was a romantic moment. She admitted to herself that his handsome face had nearly made her heart stop and chided herself to get a grip. She decided to resolutely stop herself from indulging in feelings for Enoch, as that would be her end. Just then, he announced the fish was ready, and she handed him the larger one, prioritizing him over herself. But Enoch sternly refused, reminding her that they were not in the imperial palace, and ordering her to stop with the formalities and eat her portion first, while he would take the smaller fish. He told her in a calm voice that he understood her anxiety in this unfamiliar place, but he made a clear promise that he would definitely ensure her escape and survival. Margaret looked at him, moved, while he asked her not to worry too much. She wondered to herself if he realized he was the one who hadn't been taking care of himself because he was too busy worrying about her, even though she knew the plot of the novel. His actions still touched her heart. Enoch suddenly stood up and announced his plan to send her to get help first, which made her panic at the thought of being separated. He turned to her with a sharp gaze, asking if she thought he would allow her to leave and get away from him, reminding her of his previous order to stay by his side. He approached her with confident strides and whispered in a commanding and terrifying tone that she was only allowed to leave his side when he permitted it, and demanded she remember that well. Margaret agreed with a tremble, stammering to herself that anyone who heard this would think he was a paranoid hero, but she realized the truth was simply intimidation and threats. Enoch took off his outer coat and draped it over her bare shoulders, startling her. He ordered her to cover herself up, then turned his face away and coolly explained that he was only giving her the coat because it was cold and there was no need to thank him. Margaret wrapped the coat around herself, deeply convinced that Enoch couldn't have become kind overnight and that this act was merely one of necessity. Margaret lay down comfortably, grateful that she could at least sleep warmly tonight. In contrast, Enoch sat beside her, watching her shiver from the cold, a faint sound from her nose indicating her displeasure with the weather. So he asked if she was cold. Enoch sighed in resignation, complaining that she didn't even know how to use the coat he had lent her and help cover her properly. As she drifted into a deep sleep, he watched her sleeping form and heard her muttering words of blame, describing someone as cruel and heartless. She wondered how feelings could change so quickly, amazed at his mood swings, while he wondered if she was talking to him. Suddenly, Margaret clutched the edge of the coat, recalling the moment he had draped it over her shoulders when she felt cold. He said his favorable impression of her had cooled somewhat, wondering why he had just casually draped the coat over her now. Margaret told him she was freezing and realized his contradictory behavior was just his unique way of showing concern. The next morning, Margaret woke up and stretched hard, complaining that sleeping on the sand for 2 days in a row had made her body stiff. But soon, the shocking truth hit her. Everything that happened yesterday was not a dream. So she screamed in panic, while Enoch looked at her in surprise and sarcastically commented that love seemed to be progressing well. Enoch asked if she didn't remember what had happened, so she feigned innocence and forgetfulness. But he reminded her of what she did last night. She had clung to him tightly and cried, describing him as cruel and heartless. He maliciously smiled and told her that she had held him tightly while crying, and that it seemed very natural for her. Margaret felt horrified and extremely ashamed, cursing her memory, which confirmed to her that all those embarrassing events were real and not a nightmare. She tried to deny and claimed she didn't know what he was talking about, but Enoch realized she was just pretending. She covered her mouth in shock, trying to defend her dignity as a noble, thinking it was impossible for her to have said such rude things, while Enoch touched his lips, thinking that if she was too embarrassed, he would pretend to believe her out of kindness. He coolly added that she had always been an eccentric character, so he didn't find her actions particularly reprehensible. Margaret broke down and yelled at him, demanding he just call her strange and not torture her in this cruel way. He walked away with his back to her, saying he would support her love and affection, which confused her even more. Her cheeks flushed red with shame and anger. She screamed loudly, denying that things were as he thought, and insisting her feelings were not romantic. After the storm subsided, she returned the neatly folded coat to him and sincerely thanked him for lending it to her. He took the coat, saying it was what a man should do, and told her to ask if she needed any other help. Margaret hesitated for a moment, thinking about her next plan for long-term survival. She pointed deep into the forest and suggested they explore further into the island's interior. Enoch opposed the idea, explaining that while going deeper might increase their chances of survival in terms of resources, it would make it extremely difficult for a rescue team to find them. Margaret admitted to herself that his words were correct and logical, but she knew a secret he didn't. Escaping this island was impossible before the magic gate opened, and no rescue would come. She realized that if she told him this secret now, his suspicion that she was the mastermind behind all this would increase. She found herself in an enviable position, realizing she had to insist strongly on her opinion. She bowed to him humbly and then told him a shocking decision. They had to part ways here. Margaret expressed her deep gratitude to Enoch for saving her from the monsters, stating that even though their time together was short, she felt safe and comfortable around him. But her sudden decision to leave took him by surprise, and as she turned to go, he stopped her in shock. Enoch angrily reminded her that he had clearly warned her yesterday not to leave him and that he wouldn't let her go without his permission, pointing out that her words now completely contradicted what he had said before. Margaret replied firmly, insisting she had made a logical and rational decision. She explained her point of view, saying that the monsters were the biggest threat at the moment, but staying on the exposed beach after sunset meant certain death, as there was nowhere to hide. She added that staying here meant missing the chance for the gate to open, leading to complete isolation, so finding a bunker or a cabin was a top priority. Deep down, Margaret realized the real reason for her desire to leave was her need to understand the island's secret, the secret that made her the only one who knew why she had been reincarnated into Margaret's body. She realized Enoch would see her actions as reckless and irresponsible. Enoch approached her with concern, wondering if her desire to leave was because she was afraid of him. He wondered if she was worried he would harm her, but Margaret realized he wanted to keep her close to watch her because she was suspicious. Margaret surprised him by saying she was stronger than she looked, reminding him of her achievements in hunting and building so far. Enoch cut her off firmly, announcing that he would accompany her and would not let her go alone, and told her not to worry about him, but about herself. Margaret was moved by his decision. He announced he would accompany her and continue to look for ways to get help and escape. She secretly wondered if living together had made him lighten up a bit. Margaret smiled and agreed, thinking that slowly building trust with Enoch might change her tragic future fate. As they walked through the forest, Margaret noticed something and brought it to Enoch's attention. Enoch pointed to a rocky cliff, explaining that places like that often had caves underneath. Despite the rugged and dangerous path, they agreed it was likely the best shelter for now. Enoch watched Margaret climb with difficulty, wondering in amazement if she had learned all these skills at the house of Duke Flawn. Margaret sensed his silent question and decided to offer a vague and ambiguous answer to evade an explanation. She claimed she had received various kinds of training from her family, and Enoch naively believed her, thinking the Duke's training for his daughter was very harsh. Enoch looked at her with a newfound gaze full of admiration and respect. Margaret was surprised he wasn't angry and even considered herself lucky that the lie had helped her in this situation. Suddenly, Margaret noticed a change in the weather and warned that rain was coming, suggesting they hurry to the cliff. But Margaret was tripped by her long dress, which hindered her movement, and the moment she stumbled, the dress tore with a loud rip, and Margaret fell to the ground, cursing the damn dress that had caused her so much trouble. Enoch rushed to her in a panic, calling her name and asking with extreme concern if she was hurt. He reached out to help her up, but she felt a sharp pain as she tried to stand. He saw that the sole of her foot was injured, and she felt a sharp pain that made it impossible for her to walk. Enoch sat in front of her and had her sit down so he could see what had happened to her foot. He gently lifted her injured foot to examine it, and Margaret let out a faint groan and flinched slightly from the pain and ticklish sensation of his touch. Enoch noticed the obvious swelling and redness on her ankle and finally realized the real reason she had been lagging behind and walking slowly the whole time. Enoch asked her to permit him a moment of impoliteness, and before Margaret could understand what he intended to do or react, she found herself suddenly swept up in his arms. She let out a surprised shriek, her face flushing red from the unexpected closeness, while he held her steadily. She asked in surprise and confusion what he was doing, and he replied with utmost seriousness that it would be much faster to reach the rocky cliff this way before the rain hit. He began to walk with long strides, ordering her to hold on tight so she wouldn't fall. Margaret felt extremely shy, finding her face very close to his chest, and telling herself the distance between them was far too close. The silence of the forest was broken by the sound of crow's flapping wings as it flew over the treetops, drawing Margaret's attention to the sudden noise. She stole a glance at Enoch's serious and calm face, admitting to herself that he was indeed trustworthy, just as the male lead of a novel should be. She felt he had become much friendlier and kinder to her than before, and secretly hoped this good treatment wouldn't change even after he met the original heroine. Margaret decided to take this opportunity to strengthen the trust between them and started a conversation, referring to the time they had spent together after the waves washed her onto this island. She asked him in a calm tone and with an innocent question if he felt she had really changed. She asked him to see her as a reborn person, sincerely assuring him that she would not be as reckless or nasty as in the past, and that they should be more cooperative. Enoch suddenly stopped walking, which worried her, and she nervously wondered if she had said something wrong. But he answered her calmly, confirming that talking to her was no longer as tiresome or repulsive as before, which brought comfort to her soul. But soon his tone became sharper and more serious, and he explained to her unequivocally that despite this, he would never develop any romantic feelings for her, no matter what happened. He emphasized that what he was doing now was purely out of courtesy and duty, nothing more and nothing less. He warned her coldly with a sharp gaze not to harbor any false hopes for him, as it would only bring trouble and pain to them both. Margaret was shocked by his harsh frankness, feeling a lump in her throat and nervously thinking that wasn't what she meant, but the atmosphere suddenly became awkward. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud and suspicious thud, freezing them in place, as Margaret wondered in fear about the source of the sound. They heard heavy footsteps approaching from multiple directions, and Margaret realized with horror that the sun hadn't set yet, which meant the monsters shouldn't be active now. Her eyes widened in shock and surprise when she saw a giant red wolf appear out of nowhere behind Enoch. The monster launched a fierce attack, and she screamed a warning to Enoch, falling from his arms in the chaos. Enoch anxiously shouted her name while trying to fight off the wolf attacking him, as she tried to make sense of the situation. Margaret looked around and found herself surrounded by 3 predatory wolves, which stared at her with eyes glinting with hunger, making terrifying sounds. One of the wolves opened its massive jaws and lunged at her, ready to devour her, and she gasped in terror terror, frozen in place. At the last moment, Enoch intervened and dealt the wolf a devastating blow, knocking it away from her into the ground. While grappling another wolf with his bare hands, he yelled at Margaret in anger and fear, ordering her not to just stand there and to find a safe place immediately. Margaret snapped out of her daze in this nightmare, her eyes wide as she stared ahead, realizing that to survive, she had to fight and act now. Margaret moved quickly to evade the wolves, a heavy feeling weighing on her heart. She couldn't continue to be a burden to Enoch like this, realizing she had to act fast and climb a nearby tree to save herself. Suddenly, a predatory wolf appeared behind her and bit onto her dress. She let out a scream of terror, cursing her long, heavy dress that hindered her movements and prevented her from escaping. At that critical moment, Enoch defeated a wolf and rushed towards her, while Margaret screamed internally in anger at her own incompetence and the whole situation. But the nightmare wasn't over. The wolf appeared with its jaws wide open, ready to devour her, and Enoch shouted her name in a panic-filled warning. In the face of imminent danger, Margaret's mind drifted back in memory, recalling a situation with Enoch in the palace because she had wondered then why he was so stubborn. She remembered how he had refused to marry her or even get engaged, and how she had looked down on him. She had firmly believed, deep down, that she possessed something he didn't, pure, noble blood. She now realized with deep regret that her past harsh words and arrogant behavior were the logical reason for Enoch's cold treatment of her. She told herself that even if Enoch showed some positive feelings towards her now, she felt deep down that he would never truly love her. She came to the firm conviction that escaping to the bunker alone was the only solution she had left. However, as she watched him fight desperately to protect her, she felt a pang in her heart, and for a moment, she felt the distance between them had shrunk, that they had grown a little closer. Suddenly, Margaret returned to reality and looked around in surprise, wondering if she was still alive. She remembered the terrifying moments, imagining she had almost been completely swallowed by the wolf, and wondered how she had survived. She noticed with horror that a large amount of blood was scattered around. Her gaze fell on the monster corpses lying on the ground, realizing what a brutal battle had taken place. Anxiety immediately seized her, and she began to search for Enoch with her eyes, wondering if he was injured. When she caught a glimpse of his back standing straight, she breathed a sigh of relief, thanking God he seemed to be okay. She walked towards him with hesitant steps, admitting to herself that he was the only one who would save her in this way, and asked in a trembling voice if he was all right. But she noticed something terrifying. His hand was dripping a lot of blood, and her eyes widened in shock at that moment. She suddenly remembered a detail from the novel. She recalled the side effect Enoch suffered from after the war, where he would enter a state of berserk madness whenever he saw human blood. She realized this state would force his body beyond its limits, until he completely collapsed from exhaustion. Margaret was certain she had to stop him immediately before the situation worsened. She rushed towards him, apologizing silently in her mind, as he turned to her with a terrifyingly savage gaze. In a desperate move, she forcefully smashed a large piece of wood against his head. Margaret screamed as she held the piece of wood, justifying her action in her mind. If she hadn't done it, he might have killed her in his rage. Suddenly, heavy rain began to pour down, so she carried the unconscious Enoch on her back. A while later, she found herself sitting beside him in a safe area, unable to think clearly, not even realizing how she had managed to drag him back here. She looked at him with extreme concern, noticing his health was in a very bad state. As she examined his wound closely, she noticed a strange blackening around it, which sparked a terrifying suspicion in her. The monster's claws might be poisonous. Margaret forcefully tore off the hem of her silk dress, determined to use it as a makeshift bandage. She bandaged the unconscious Enoch's wound with extreme care, telling herself the situation was very urgent and she had to provide at least basic first aid to save the situation. When she was done, she looked with satisfaction at the wound, which was now cleaned, covered with herbs, and wrapped with a piece of cloth, and declared the mission complete. She sat beside him and breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that the immediate danger had finally passed. Margaret sat and watched the sleeping Enoch, realizing she had to wait until he fully regained consciousness. But a terrible premonition haunted her. If he woke up still in a berserk and crazed state, her life would be in certain danger, and she would be unable to defend herself. She found some tough vines hanging from the top of the cave and decided to use them as a precaution to restrain his movements, just in case. Enoch slowly opened his eyes, his vision clearing, and he wondered where he was in a hoarse and confused voice. Suddenly, he became aware of his strange situation, looked at his hands and feet in shock, found himself tightly bound, and let out a surprised scream at the horrifying sight. Margaret watched him calmly, holding some water and herbs in her hand, and coolly asked how he felt after waking up. Ignoring his shock, he shot her an angry glare, furiously asking what she had done to him and why she had tied him up in such a humiliating way. His eyes glinted with a terrifying light, and he commanded her to untie him immediately in a roar that resembled a beast's growl. Margaret noticed, from his glowing eyes, that the berserk symptoms were still present, realizing he couldn't be allowed to move yet. Enoch tried to tear the vines with his muscular strength, so she grabbed his hand and seriously warned him that strenuous movement would worsen his wound and endanger his life. He looked at her sharply, disapproving of her being so bold with him and interfering in his affairs. But she cut him off firmly, raising a finger to his face and ordering him to stop resisting. She boldly placed her finger directly in front of his face, commanding him in a domineering tone to remain completely still. To her surprise, Enoch froze in place, the anger around him dissipating, while his face turned bright red with shame and confusion at the situation. Margaret looked at him in surprise, then at her own hand, unable to believe that this simple gesture had actually succeeded in calming him down. She told herself that this calm reaction was never mentioned in the original story, and she had never seen it before, while Enoch was wondering in surprise why he was suddenly unable to move and felt numb in front of her. Margaret continued to soothe him, gently stroking his face and telling him that everything was fine and he could stop resisting now. Enoch yielded to her gentle touch, his expression returning to calm. Then his body tilted towards her and collapsed. He lost consciousness again, falling to the ground asleep. She then let out a sigh of relief, thanking God for getting her safely through this crisis. She shuddered, imagining what a gruesome scene it would have been if things had gone wrong and she had failed to calm him down. She would have ended up torn to pieces, just like the monsters they had fought before. She recalled the plot from the original novel, where Enoch would completely lose his sanity and fall into a state of madness upon seeing blood. She remembered that the original heroine, Yuenna, used to calm him down in those moments with hugs and passionate, romantic kisses. That incident was a turning point that deepened their emotional bond and the story's development. Margaret looked at herself sorrowfully, realizing the ironic paradox. What was a romantic and sensual scene for the heroine Yuenna had turned into a fierce and exhausting battle for survival for her. She wearily muttered to herself about the cruelty of reality. As morning arrived, the rain finally stopped and the sun rose to illuminate the forest. Margaret stood there, wiping the sweat from her forehead, grateful that the difficult night had ended safely. Margaret noticed that Enoch's condition was much better than last night, even though he had been running a high fever all night. She turned to him and found that he had opened his eyes, so she anxiously asked if he was okay. She immediately realized he must be thirsty and brought the water canteen to his lips, letting him drink first. Enoch greedily sipped the water while still bound. Although she was relieved that he had regained consciousness, she was also worried that leaving him tied up like this could worsen his health. Margaret decided she needed to go find some medicinal herbs. As she prepared to leave, she told Enoch that she was going to gather some herbs for his wounds and something to eat, telling him to wait. Enoch silently watched her leave the cave, thinking that she could have at least untied his wrists. Margaret wandered through the forest and began gathering plants, finding a useful one that could stop bleeding and deciding to collect more of it. She sat in the grass, collecting some stems, telling herself she had to get back before dark. Suddenly, she heard a suspicious sound from ahead and froze, terrified and wondering if she had really heard something. Fear crept into her heart, worried it was a monster, but she quickly reassured herself that the midday sun was very strong, and it was impossible for monsters to appear at this time. Suddenly, the silhouette of a person appeared before her, and she realized that even if it was a human, the problem might be even bigger. She recalled a fact in her mind. The only people on this island were the 5 male leads, the heroine Enoch, and herself. She prayed deep down that it wasn't the person she feared, thinking that taking care of Enoch alone was hard enough. And what would she do if there were more people? Screaming internally as she completely rejected the idea. But she got a clear look at the figure behind the trees. When she saw the silver hair, red eyes, and an earring dangling from his ear, her eyes widened in surprise. She immediately recognized the identity of the person standing before her. It was Kaden Blakerode. The moment her eyes fell on him, she turned and ran at full speed, cursing her bad luck for running into the wrong person, while he shouted from behind for her to stop. Margaret realized she had finally come face to face with the male lead she had to avoid at all costs. She recalled the details of the original novel, although Enoch was the one who held the strongest hatred for Margaret Rose. Flawn, the one who posed the biggest and most direct threat to her life, was Kaden, because at a decisive moment in the novel, Margaret died at his hands. Margaret reviewed Kaden's history. He was the second son of the Rode family. When he was a child, he was kidnapped by the temple and used as a lab rat for their projects. At the time, his father, Marker Rode, had made a suspicious deal with the temple, and the incident of his kidnapping and experimentation was covered up in an absurd and questionable manner. That painful past became the spark that ignited the fire of malice in his heart, and Kaden grew up harboring a deep hatred for both his family and the temple. As a result, he began to wander around, sabotaging every experiment managed by the temple and every project funded by his family. Margaret realized that in the original novel, he had no personal reason to specifically target Margaret Rose Flawn, but the problem was the timing of the events. During that precise period, Margaret was forcefully pushing for the execution of a certain project. Margaret recalled in horror that the project was the temple's love potion experiment and realized it was her involvement in it that made her a target of his deadly wrath. Kaden grabbed Margaret's hand tightly to stop her, telling her to wait. Margaret remembered that Kaden had specifically gone to Duke Flawn's territory, caused a huge scene, and created chaos. But the Margaret of that time refused to back down, stubbornly insisting on completing the experiment by force despite his opposition. It was because of that incident and her stubborn actions that the seeds of hatred began to take root in Kaden's heart against Margaret. In the present, Margaret tried to break free from his grasp, screaming at him to get away from her, while he tried to stop her, telling her to be quiet for a moment. He coldly asked if she was all right, and she flinched in pain from the impact of their collision, putting a hand to her face. She noticed that a heavy metal necklace hanging from Kaden's robe had fallen off. Looking at the necklace that landed in her hand, she realized it was very heavy and wondered if it was what had hit her cheek and caused the pain. Kaden stared at her features, feeling like he had seen her face before. He struggled to recall where he had seen her. He confirmed that her features were very familiar, especially her blue eyes. He reached out a hand, pulling her up with a sarcastic smile, quietly apologizing for his rudeness and telling her to stand properly. Margaret recalled a detail from the novel where Kaden met a woman who looked like a noble in a desolate place, realizing that anyone would find such a situation suspicious. She focused her gaze on the earring dangling by his ear and realized a dangerous fact. Without this earring, Kaden couldn't regulate his magic. In the original story, this magic-regulating earring had shattered the moment Kaden woke up on the island. Because of this, the magic couldn't circulate properly in his body, causing him to suddenly develop a high fever, and at times, he would completely lose control of his emotions and actions. She remembered that the only person who could soothe that hysterical state was the original heroine, Enoch. Kaden approached her with a terrifying expression and glowing eyes, asking why she was running away. Margaret felt terrified, nervously worrying if he would enter a berserk state like Enoch. He, however, mocked her for her sudden silence, speechless despite her earlier screaming. He leaned towards her with a strange smile, asking what she had just said. Margaret nervously and fearfully asked what he wanted from her. He gave an unexpected assessment, describing her as beautiful, which made her scream in his face in shock. She called him crazy, and he took her hand, proposing that they get along. Margaret thought sarcastically to herself that she had no intention of getting along with him at all. He stared at her intently, noticing that she really did resemble someone he knew, no matter how he tried to deny it. Suddenly, his eyes lit up as if he had solved a puzzle. With a cunning smile and a provocative tone, he excitedly asked aloud if she was that crazy Miss Flawn from the Langrid Empire. Margaret was enraged by the title and screamed in his face, objecting to being called crazy. He grabbed a lock of her hair, pointing out that her hair color was the same, confirming his suspicions. Margaret forcefully shook off his hand and screamed at him, scolding him for his rudeness and for daring to say such things and lay a hand on a delicate lady. She looked at him coldly and said it was fine. And Margaret's memory returned to the moment Kaden came to the Flawn mansion to demand a halt to the experiment sponsorship. Margaret remembered that fleeting moment in the past when, amidst a crowd of knights, her gaze had met his. It was an extremely brief and swift encounter, yet it had left an indelible mark. Kaden now stood before her, struggling to search his memory, while she told herself that her appearance might not be completely clear in his mind, giving her a chance to escape. Margaret asked nervously, pretending not to know his identity. But he replied with a sharp gaze and a confident tone, introducing himself as Kaden Blakerode. Kaden suddenly moved closer to her, cornering her with his sharp gaze, and seriously asked if she really knew who he was. Then he tilted his head and whispered directly, "So you're really not Miss Flawn?" Margaret denied it quickly and decisively. Kaden then showed a mysterious smile, muttering that it was a good thing and a relief. His expression suddenly became more ferocious and threatening, and he admitted with a terrifying smile that he despised the woman named Margaret and couldn't stand her existence. Margaret felt the blood drain from her veins, consumed by the genuine fear brought on by his malicious words and gaze. She described the feeling as if the blood had dried up in her veins. She realized the level of danger this man represented was completely different from Enoch's previous threat. She was certain deep down that if Kaden discovered her true identity, he was indeed someone who could end her life in cold blood. Suddenly, Kaden stopped in his tracks, his expression shifting from threatening to surprised, which confused Margaret, who didn't know the reason for his sudden change in behavior. Kaden swayed and unexpectedly fell heavily onto her, causing her to scream in shock. Margaret tried to support him, asking in surprise what he meant by this behavior. He, however, mumbled incomprehensible words, describing the situation as strange. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, whispering in a sleepy voice that she gave off a sweet scent, which made her feel panicked and disgusted. Margaret screamed internally, rejecting the closeness, and tried to push him away with all her might. She noticed his attention was completely scattered, and he was in a state of temporary weakness. Realizing this was her perfect chance to escape, she used all her strength to kick his leg, and he fell to the ground, crying out in pain. She turned and ran at full speed, ignoring his calls from behind for her to stop and wait. Margaret ran breathlessly through the forest, realizing that even if Kaden didn't kill her now, she would die at his hands one day if she stayed near him. She suddenly reached a dead end, finding herself on the edge of a towering cliff. She looked down in terror and spotted some hanging vines. Although she trembled at the thought of dying at his hands, she decided to take the risk. She grabbed the vines and jumped to another ledge, telling herself she didn't want to live in such fear. She thought that having one dangerous person like Enoch around was more than enough. She didn't have the energy to endure Kaden as well. Kaden walked to the edge of the cliff and looked across, an expression of admiration and surprise on his face, wondering sarcastically if she was really the delicate, noble lady she claimed to be. Margaret hid in the bushes, panting, hoping he wouldn't follow her here, thinking that getting rid of one of the male leads was a remarkable achievement. Suddenly, she noticed something glowing in her hand and found that she was still holding Kaden's brooch, which she had unconsciously grabbed during their struggle. She looked anxiously at the sparkling brooch, terrified that he might now come after her, not to kill her, but to retrieve this precious item. She looked up and noticed the sun was beginning to set, which meant it was time for the monsters to become active. She realized it would be very dangerous to move recklessly now, and noted that she had run far from the cave to avoid revealing Enoch's hiding place to Kaden. A wave of worry for the injured Enoch, left alone in the cave, washed over her, but she shook her head to dismiss the thought, deciding that her own safety was the priority at this moment. She found a suitable hiding spot under a rock by a stream and decided to take shelter there. She sat there, determined not to move until the sun rose and it was safe to move. But suddenly, something touched her foot, catching her attention. She looked down at her feet curiously, wondering what it was. Her eyes widened in surprise when she realized what the glittering object before her was. She screamed internally, telling herself to wait and confirm. It was a first aid kit, the very same one that the heroine Enoch had found in the original story. Margaret hugged the bag tightly to her chest, overwhelmed by a huge sense of happiness and a profound sense of survival, as if she had found a lifeline in a flood. She eagerly opened the bag to check its contents and found povidone iodine disinfectant, painkillers, cold medicine, and fever reducers, all with modern Korean labels on them. She noticed it was taking her longer to read the Korean words, realizing that her original memories were becoming intertwined with Margaret's, affecting the speed at which she understood her native language. She sighed in relief, murmuring gratefully that with these tools, she could finally treat Enoch's wounds properly. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed, and she sensed a strange presence, cursing under her breath as she realized danger was near. She quickly hid under a large rock, clutching the bag tightly, wondering in surprise how this thing had arrived so quickly. She held her breath, watching a shadow pass by her, silently praying and begging for it to pass safely without noticing her presence. She heard very heavy footsteps shaking the ground and immediately realized they couldn't be the footsteps of a wolf. She saw huge bear-like paw prints appearing one after another, and briefly suspected it might be Kaden looking for her, but she dismissed the thought due to the heavy and eerie nature of the footsteps. The footsteps suddenly stopped, so she very carefully peeked at the owner of the shadow and gasped in shock. She saw 2 legs covered in thick black fur in front of her, twice the thickness of an adult man's. She raised her gaze upwards and realized a terrifying fact. This was not human at all. It was a huge monster that resembled an ape, standing tall and exuding a terrifying aura. Muscles rippled with its breath. The monster placed a huge hand on the rock she was hiding behind, and Margaret realized that if it continued searching like this, it would inevitably find her. She was certain that if it saw her, it would eat her alive. In this difficult moment, an image of Enoch flashed through her mind, and she wished with all her fearful heart that he was there to protect her. Fortunately, the monster slowly moved away, its heavy footsteps disappearing deep into the forest. Margaret remained where she was, trembling violently, forcing herself to suppress her sobs and swallow her tears all night, terrified it might return. In the moonlight, she let her tears flow for the first time, admitting to herself how much she wanted to see Enoch at that moment. In the morning, she retraced her steps back through the forest with the bag on her back, wondering in surprise about the nature of the creature she had seen. She realized it wasn't an ordinary wild animal, and remembered that the monsters in the original novel could change their bodies and evolve, which made them terrifying. But she had never seen or read about a monster with such a bizarre and unsettling appearance before, which added to her anxiety. She suddenly remembered the wolf she had faced earlier, and how its body had changed bit by bit, unlike a normal wolf. She felt deeply distressed, wondering why she felt the difficulty level on this island was becoming increasingly complex and cruel, like it was on hell mode. She wondered in despair if she really had what it took to endure and survive on this island until the end. When she finally reached the entrance of the cave, she walked in with a weary smile, calling out loudly for Enoch and telling him she was back with medicine. She apologized for being late, but was struck speechless with shock when she found the cave empty, wondering in terror where His Highness had gone. The first aid kit slipped from Margaret's hands as she fell into a state of dismay and shock, having never imagined that Enoch might leave and abandon her. A pang of pain shot through her heart, and dark thoughts took hold of her, and she wondered if he had met the heroine Enoch in her absence. She was certain that if he had, he would have abandoned her without a second thought, casting her aside. In despair, she decided that if Enoch wasn't here, there was no reason for her to stay either, and resolved to search for the bunker alone as originally planned. But suddenly, Enoch appeared behind her, calling her name in a tone full of longing and anxiety, causing her to freeze in place. Margaret turned to him with tears in her eyes, admitting in a trembling voice that she thought he had left and abandoned her. Enoch looked at her with relief, and she noticed his complexion was slightly better, telling him softly that she was glad. Margaret was bewildered by his intense and deep gaze, wondering to herself why he was looking at her like that again. She thought Enoch was thinking about the moment he woke up and didn't see her, when he had panicked, worried that something bad had happened to her during her absence. She realized with a shock that Enoch had thought she had run away and abandoned him, something that had never even crossed her mind. She reached out a hand to him, clearing up the misunderstanding and reminding him that she had told him beforehand she was going to look for herbs and wouldn't leave him. Margaret's expression suddenly brightened, and she proudly opened the first aid kit, announcing that she had found a more valuable prize than herbs, only to realize she had interrupted his serious moment. Enoch stared at her blankly, and Margaret realized that valuable prize or modern terms were foreign to him, and he didn't understand. Enoch noticed her unusual posture and pointed out that something was wrong with her injuries. But Margaret tried to change the subject with a nervous smile, suggesting they treat his wounds first. Suddenly, Enoch quickly approached and grabbed her, taking her by surprise. He looked directly into her eyes with a sharp, emotion-filled gaze and commanded her in a stern voice never to do that again. He explained seriously that he would be fine, warning her not to do something so dangerous again just to find some foolish herbs. He rested his forehead against hers, leaving Margaret to wonder in surprise at the reason for his strange behavior and the sudden romantic atmosphere that had appeared around them. Deep inside, Margaret panicked at this drastic change in the male lead's personality, wishing time could rewind a little so she could figure out what had happened. The scene flashes back to a short while ago, with Enoch waking up alone in the cave at sunset, his body aching. He looked at his wounds and saw they were carefully bandaged with a piece of torn cloth, realizing it was part of Margaret's dress. He felt surprised and appreciative that the daughter of a high noble family knew how to treat wounds so skillfully. He looked around the empty cave, and anxiety began to creep into his heart, wondering where Margaret had disappeared to. He tried to reassure himself that she must have just gone out to gather more herbs, as she had said. However, as he waited, the facts he had observed in his short time on the island began to take shape in his mind. He remembered the first pattern of danger, the monsters and wolves that had attacked him and Margaret before. He realized a terrifying fact. These monsters didn't appear during the day, but began to move and hunt as soon as night fell. He suddenly jumped up, cursing the situation, realizing the danger of her wandering outside alone this late at night. He started running at full speed through the forest. He ran at an extremely fast pace, thinking that in his usual state, he would have been prepared to sacrifice his life without hesitation in such a situation. He admitted to himself that normally, he wouldn't even think of searching for a lady like Margaret Flawn. But one thing became clear as he panted from exhaustion. Margaret had helped him without hesitation and was prepared to do anything for him, so he couldn't just leave her. Enoch realized a painful truth deep inside. If she weren't here, he couldn't have endured and survived until now. However, the echo of his previous vow rang in his mind, a promise he had made to himself not to develop any feelings for her and to tell her not to have false hopes for him, as it would only cause trouble for both of them. He slammed his fist against a tree trunk to vent his anger, painfully reflecting on the reason for his pathetic behavior and how he had cornered her with his sharp words when she had no one else to rely on in a place like this. Enoch felt the fear Margaret must have felt upon waking up in a strange and desolate place, without any support, and he cursed himself under his breath, recalling the memory of that night when he had prayed sincerely and fervently. He remembered how he had knelt and pleaded, hoping with all his heart that Margaret was alive and safe. Enoch returned to the present and suddenly brought his face close to hers, startling her and surprising her with his action. He looked directly into her eyes and issued a command in a calm but firm tone, demanding that from now on, she stop using formal titles and just call him by his name, Enoch. Margaret froze, stammering as she asked why. She noticed his strange gaze and told herself that Enoch was not acting normally, as it was impossible for him to be so gentle with Margaret. She tried to explain the situation by thinking that people change when under the pressure of harsh environments, wondering if that was the case with him now. Suddenly, he reached out and cupped her face, making her wonder in shock what this gesture was. Enoch anxiously examined her face, pointing to a minor wound and asking her seriously who did it. As she was surprised by his question, She gently pushed his hand away, assuring him that she was fine and there was no need to worry, while thinking to herself how strange his abnormal behavior was. Margaret was shocked to hear such humble words from his mouth, thinking he might still be feverish and delirious, and stated that she didn't want to cause trouble for either of them. She forced a smile and told him not to mind her, trying to build a barrier between them. Her words struck Enoch like a bolt from the blue. He immediately remembered that it was he who had previously told her not to have false hopes, because it would be annoying. Enoch sat on the ground, regret written all over his face, wondering in surprise if his own words had dealt her such a huge blow that she was now throwing them back at him. In contrast, Margaret turned her face away from him, deciding internally that she had to stop caring and couldn't let her guard down just because she felt sorry for him. Margaret suddenly changed the subject, announcing that she was starving and suggesting, with the first aid kit in hand. She suggested with a practical smile that they go hunt for something to eat, adding as she looked at him that would be after she treated his wounds first, of course. Enoch looked at her with a grateful and calm gaze, thanking her in a faint voice. Margaret excitedly opened the first aid kit and announced the start of the wound disinfection. She warned him it might sting a little, and as she applied the disinfectant, Enoch groaned softly from the sting. She finished the job quickly and efficiently, telling him with a smile that it was all taken care of, and Enoch expressed his admiration for her skill. She told him he could move now. He stared thoughtfully at the medicine in the bag. He suddenly grabbed the disinfectant bottle and asked with suspicion and curiosity how she knew this liquid was a disinfectant. Margaret froze, realizing she couldn't actually read the writing on the packaging, and nervously wondered how to explain this to him. Margaret tried to save the situation by explaining her knowledge of the strange writing on the bottle, gesturing with her hands as she explained to Enoch about the eastern continent across the sea, claiming it was the language used there and that she had studied it a little before. She let out an internal sigh of relief, glad that she had used the original Margaret's memories to concoct a convincing excuse, and was relieved that Enoch had easily believed her lie without suspicion. Deep down, however, the question of the novel's author's intent still bothered her. What was the purpose of placing a strange and illogical plot device like a Korean survival kit in this fantasy world? She looked bewilderedly at the bag, full of mysteries, realizing its existence was not just a coincidence, but a puzzle that needed to be solved. Enoch suddenly interrupted her thoughts, pointing to the wound on her face and asking with a scrutinizing gaze if she intended to keep the cause of that injury a secret. Margaret grew tense, her fingers pressed against her cheek, as she anxiously speculated whether his question meant he had already noticed something. She began to quickly analyze the current situation. In reality, there was no real reason to hide the truth about her meeting with Kaden from Enoch, especially since the plot of the original novel had already begun to unfold. She realized that, in the context of the story, Enoch was destined to meet Kaden sooner or later. Therefore, she decided to tell him part of the truth, saying that she had met a strange man in the forest. This surprised Enoch, who repeated her words in astonishment. She explained that a necklace had fallen from the man's robe and happened to hit her cheekbone, causing the wound. Enoch listened with a serious expression, wondering how such a thing could happen. In that moment, Margaret remembered what had actually happened, and how unlucky she had been to fall under Kaden and be pinned down by him, a scene far more dangerous than her account. Suddenly, she saw Enoch crush a stone with his bare hand and realized what terrifying strength the man possessed. Enoch asked her sternly if she still did not know the man's identity, while she watched him nervously. Margaret took out the item she had picked up, an ornate purple brooch. She said she had found the object that hit her in the face and presumed it belonged to that man. Just as Margaret had expected, Enoch recognized the brooch the moment he saw it. Enoch told her it was the emblem of the magic tower, confirming Kaden's identity. Margaret seized this moment of candor to ask a bold and fateful question, asking if he has an episode when he sees blood. Enoch was bewildered by the direct question, but Margaret explained that she knew it was rude, but since they were going to travel together, she desperately needed to know the truth. She told herself that the risks she had to take were too great, from surviving in the wilderness, avoiding monsters, and maintaining Enoch's trust, to steering clear of the crazy male leads. Enoch covered his face with his hands in anguish, admitting that his condition used to be manageable, but the seizures only started after returning from the battlefield, and that he had managed to control it in the palace because he rarely saw blood and had been on medication. Margaret was shocked, screaming internally in disbelief. Does this mean that without medication, he doesn't even know how to control his condition? She realized the situation was even worse than she had imagined. Enoch turned his face away, ashamed of his own weakness. But Margaret remembered something important. The last time he went into a frenzy, that violent aura had indeed subsided, which meant there was a way to suppress the symptoms. Margaret wondered in confusion what exactly happened in that moment that calmed him down. Was it something she did? Enoch interrupted her thoughts, telling her in a faint and hesitant voice that when she asked him to stop, it seemed to have an effect. Hearing this, Margaret's eyes widened in surprise, both astonished and confused about what he meant. She covered her mouth in surprise, doubting what she had just heard, while Enoch's face turned red and he looked away. Enoch began to explain his feelings, saying that even as a child during fierce competitions with his brothers, and even on the battlefield losing comrades and witnessing death firsthand, he recalled those painful memories when he was indulging in blood and slaughter, and no one had ever dared to say those words to him, telling him to stop or that it was enough. He looked at Margaret with a meaningful gaze, admitting that perhaps those were the words he had needed to hear all along. He explained to her that, as mentioned before, the condition was a side effect of the war, as the memories of the Roman legion's battles were so intense and painful that seeing blood would make him completely lose his mind. Margaret saw the blood flowing from Enoch's hand and screamed in terror, telling him to stop immediately. But Enoch very calmly reassured her, dismissing them as trivial little scratches not worth such worry, which made her feel a relief mixed with tension. Margaret looked at him sadly, thinking of his harsh solitude, with no one to comfort him or lighten his burden as he endured all this psychological and physical trauma alone. Enoch broke the silence with a precise analysis, pointing out that if there was indeed a word that could stop his episodes and control him, it was probably the words Margaret had shouted in his face at that time. Margaret felt she was learning dangerous secrets she shouldn't be hearing, and she recalled the plot of the original novel, where the female lead, Anna, healed his trauma through intimate physical contact. But she realized that it wasn't a fundamental solution for the trauma itself. She watched his excessively handsome face in the sunlight, telling herself in surprise that no one could imagine a perfect man like him would want to be controlled in such a way. Margaret decided that knowing the trigger or the method to stop it was a good thing, as it would at least ensure future safety. But she turned and sternly warned Enoch, demanding that if he thought he might see blood, he should immediately get away from her and avoid the situation. Enoch apologized in advance for any danger he might cause her. He curiously asked about the type of medicine she used for her wound, so she enthusiastically pointed to the ointment in her bag, explaining its purpose. But Enoch did not apply it to himself. Instead, he unexpectedly placed his hand on hers, leaving her extremely confused and wondering why he was doing that. Enoch pointed to her face and seriously asked if she should apply some ointment there as well. He approached her with a serious expression, asking her sternly what that man had done to her this time, and ordered her to come closer. Margaret nervously explained that, as she had told him before, what happened was just an accident, hiding from him the fact that she had kicked Kaden and run away, and that she had gotten lost and hidden until morning. Enoch began to gently apply the ointment to her cheek and gave a strict order. She was not to consider acting alone until they escaped this island. Margaret agreed with a false smile, while internally confirming that she was, of course, lying and had no intention of complying at all. After encountering Kaden, she realized that simply staying quietly by Enoch's side was not enough to ensure her safety. She told herself that she had to find any clues about the location of the secret bunker as soon as possible. However, the exhaustion from the arduous journey seemed to have finally taken its toll on her, and Margaret completely collapsed and was bedridden for several days. She finally woke up, feeling nauseous while sitting by a stream, complaining that she never thought she would suffer from stomach discomfort in a place like this. She realized that drinking impure water was the cause and decided it would be best to make an effort to drink purified water from now on. Margaret began to apply a method to purify water. She placed a coconut shell filled with stream water in a higher position and an empty container in a lower one and secured them in place. Then, she connected the two containers with a long, tightly woven strip of cotton cloth, with half of the strip hanging on each side. She explained the process to herself. Over time, the impurities would settle at the bottom, and the water would travel through the cloth by gravity and drip into the empty container, after which she would boil the collected water. The process was a success, and she finally had clean drinking water, feeling happy with her achievement. She looked at her tattered dress, consoling herself that despite the dress being completely ruined, thankfully the inner shirt was made of cotton. She sat by the river, remembering with surprise how Enoch had meticulously cared for her during her illness. She wondered in confusion if he had really started to trust her, thinking that perhaps there was no need to run away from him as long as those harsh laws from the original novel didn't apply now. But soon, fear and doubt crept back in. What if he meets the original female lead later on? His feelings change, and he returns to the original story's path. She realized with anguish that she had to consider this possibility and couldn't let her guard down just because of a temporary sense of security. As she was muttering to herself that she needed to find the bunker before that happened, a shadow suddenly appeared behind her. Enoch had returned with a bountiful catch of fish, looking at Margaret with a gentle reprimand, reminding her that he had told her to rest a little longer. But Margaret, her thoughts occupied by hunger, replied internally that food was the #1 priority for survival. Enoch suggested they go back and fill their stomachs first, so Margaret enthusiastically agreed and followed behind him. As they were walking through the forest, Enoch suddenly stopped, causing Margaret to bump hard into his solid back and let out a pain groan. She asked in surprise why he had suddenly stopped, then peeked out from behind him to see what he was looking at, only for her expression to freeze in shock. She saw an unexpected scene, a silver-haired man lying in a patch of flowers, seemingly unconscious. Margaret immediately realized it was Kaden, while Enoch cursed under his breath, calling him a bastard, which indicated that he recognized him too. Enoch started to walk toward the man with clear aggressive intent, so Margaret tried to stop him, telling him to wait a moment. Margaret looked anxiously at the unconscious Kaden. Enoch coldly asked her if this was the owner of the necklace that had caused her injury, and Margaret hesitantly gave an affirmative answer. She wondered in confusion how he could be here, as she was sure she had successfully misled him and escaped. Had he wandered randomly until he reached here? Enoch immediately made a judgment, sternly announcing that they had to tie him up, which surprised Margaret. Enoch cautiously explained his decision, stating that this man might possess dangerous abilities, so they had to be extremely careful. Margaret stammered, trying to object, but Enoch hastily grabbed her hand, pointing out that the sun was about to set, and they had to act quickly before dark. Suddenly, Kaden forcefully pulled her towards him. Enoch anxiously asked if she was okay, and Margaret told him she was fine, just as he had suggested. As they began to move their luggage to their hiding spot, Margaret was surprised to find that she couldn't break free from Kaden's grasp. She looked down to find Kaden's hand gripping her tightly while he was still lying on the ground. Enoch approached her, telling her to wait a moment until he helped her. He then helped her free her hand from Kaden's grasp, seeing the red mark Kaden's strong grip had left on Margaret's wrist. Enoch's expression became cold and frighteningly angry. He turned to her and asked in a tone that was both calm and terrifying if he should kill him. Margaret panicked and shouted at him, denouncing the idea of killing someone just for a simple mark on her wrist, and stood between him and Kaden, waving her hands. She scolded him, saying he had to learn to control his anger, and Enoch revealed a mysterious sideways smile. He suddenly burst out laughing, surprising Margaret, and then announced that he agreed. He looked at her with a deep and confusing gaze and whispered to her that if that's what she wanted, he agreed. And so she wondered internally about the reason for that smile. Enoch cast his gaze toward Kaden, realizing that this man was the Archmage Kaden. Margaret thought it was natural that he would recognize him immediately. It would be absurd for the Crown Prince of the Empire not to know one of the 5 great mages of the continent. Enoch decided to move the luggage first and then come back to get Kaden. He admitted that he didn't like the situation, but acknowledged that in this case, knowing a mage could be useful to them. He told her he would take him with them, but he would keep him tied up at all times. Margaret smiled, thinking that Enoch was asking for her opinion and interpreting it as a sign that his trust in her had truly increased. Enoch turned to her with a sharp and determined gaze, adding in a tone that brooked no argument that if she didn't agree to tying him up, he would throw him out. Margaret nervously realized that he wasn't actually asking for her opinion, but dictating his terms, and his sharpness made her break out in a cold sweat. Margaret supported Enoch's opinion with a relieved smile, telling him not to worry. She looked at the man lying on the ground and suggested to him that they tie him up for now as a necessary safety precaution. Margaret bent down to carefully examine Kaden's condition and covered her mouth in shock, muttering in surprise at the gruesome state of the wound, wondering how anyone could have sustained such a horrific injury. Her thoughts went back to a short while ago, remembering the huge explosion that had echoed through the forest, and she guessed internally that the explosion was the reason behind this tragic condition. She watched Kaden's pained face and listened to his faint groans, wondering if he had been at the center of that explosion. Margaret decided to postpone her questions until he regained consciousness, and turned to Enoch, sternly warning him not to look at the wound, as it was extremely gruesome and might affect him. But her warning came too late. Enoch's body began to tremble, his face turned red, and he clutched his head in pain, asking her in a struggling voice to tie him up as well before it was too late. Suddenly, Enoch lost control of himself, rushed toward Margaret and cornered her, causing her to scream in pain and surprise, demanding that he stop. Enoch paused, panting with a flushed face. Margaret looked at him, realizing that the command method she had used before really worked. She thought in surprise that despite his immense physical strength that could easily crush her, he would actually turn into a submissive and innocent person once she issued a loud command. Margaret gathered her courage, looked him straight in the eye, and ordered him to get away from her and stop immediately. She watched him with a sharp and commanding gaze, repeating her command with a single firm word. Now that Enoch had responded to her command, his berserk aura began to fade, his tense body relaxed, and he fell to the ground unconscious. Having brought the situation under control, Margaret sat down and sighed in relief, glad that things had ended peacefully, while tying Enoch up with plant vines and telling herself to maintain higher vigilance from now on. As she tightened the ropes, she felt frustrated and confused, wondering how the characters in the original novel had survived without her, especially since the female lead, Yuana, never had to tie up Enoch so brutally in the original story. Margaret shook these thoughts from her head and returned grimly to reality, determining that her current priority was to stop the continuous bleeding. After a while, Enoch fully regained consciousness, looked around in shock, and asked what he had done, then turned to Margaret with extreme concern, asking if she was okay. Enoch looked at the ropes binding him, and Margaret helped him untie his bonds. He put his head in his hands with deep guilt, admitting his actions were indefensible, and anxiously repeated his question about whether her wound was okay. Margaret reassured him, confirming that they had cleaned Kaden's wound and used a hemostatic agent, so he would be fine. But Enoch interrupted her with a serious expression, reaching out and touching her face, clarifying that his question was not about the mage. He gently stroked her cheek, explaining that he was asking about her wound. Confused by his proximity and gentle touch, Margaret's cheeks flushed, and she stammered her reply that she was completely fine. Enoch told her in a serious and cold tone that if she ever wanted to get rid of Kaden, that bastard, she just had to tell him. He assured her with a terrifying smile that it wouldn't be difficult for him at all. And Margaret thought in horror that getting rid of Kaden, one of the strongest mages, would absolutely be difficult and disastrous. Margaret imagined the situation, wondering if Enoch was trying to provoke the mage's anger again, while Enoch insisted that killing him would make things much simpler. Margaret felt a chill and looked at him doubtfully, wondering if this man was really serious about his deadly threat. She put her head in her hands, genuinely worried they would end up losing their minds and going crazy like in the original novel. The day passed like that, and they treated Kaden's wound and took turns watching over him throughout the night. In the morning, they looked at the still unconscious Kaden. Margaret stared at Kaden's pale face, anxiously wondering if his wound was poison like the monster that had attacked Enoch before. The next day, despite the passage of time, Kaden had still not woken from his coma, but the regularity of his breathing and the calmness of his expression indicated that his condition was steadily improving. The two decided to leave him there for the time, being and go explore the area around the cave in search of an exit or a better shelter. As they walked through the dense forest, Margaret was suffering from the high temperature and suffocating humidity, which left her panting and drenched in sweat. Margaret recalled her memory of the original novel, confirming to herself that a bunker and a wooden cabin did exist somewhere on this island. She clearly remembered that the wooden cabin was located near a steep rocky cliff and rugged terrain, and recalled the view from the mountaintop she had climbed earlier, where she had seen that the island contained 3 main, large mountains. Margaret decided to devise a search plan, suggesting that they first start by combing through the area near the mountain she and Enoch had climbed, and if they didn't find the cabin or bunker there, they would move on to search the other 2 mountains. The heat of the vertically shining sun intensified, causing Margaret's vision to become blurry and hazy, and she felt the ground beneath her feet swaying due to severe fatigue. Her foot suddenly tripped, and she was about to fall, but Enoch intervened with lightning speed, catching her before she hit the ground, calling her name and warning her to be more careful. As she held onto his arm tightly to regain her balance, her gaze fell on his bare arm, noticing the many scars of varying depths covering his skin, as she immediately realized that these old wounds were painful medals he had brought back from the bloody battlefield. As she stared at the scars, her thoughts drifted for a moment, so Enoch anxiously asked if she was okay, causing her to quickly jump away and answer in a flustered manner that nothing was wrong. She placed her hand on her face, which was hot from the heat, trying to convince herself that her blush was just caused by the hot weather, and internally scolded herself for staring at and touching someone else's body in such a way. Suddenly, without any warning, Enoch lifted her into his arms, causing her to let out a surprised shriek at his sudden action. She stammered, asking what he was doing, and he replied with complete seriousness that at this level of fatigue, she could collapse at any moment, so he couldn't let her walk. As he continued to walk while holding her, he told her that there was a stream nearby where they could cool off a bit. He asked her to endure for a little while longer until they arrived. So Margaret yielded to the inevitable and shyly grabbed his shirt and agreed. They finally reached the stream, and Margaret sat on the bank and put her feet in the cool water, feeling a wave of instant refreshment and sighing in relief as the heat dissipated from her body. Enoch politely turned his back to her, telling her he would stand guard and that she should take her time resting before they left. He was about to walk away a little, but suddenly turned back to tell her to call him if she needed anything, only to be frozen on the spot by the sight before him. He saw Margaret trying to take off the upper part of her dress, revealing her skin. Enoch was shocked by the scene. Margaret innocently asked him what he had just said, as she couldn't hear him clearly due to the sound of the water. Enoch turned around with lightning speed, his back to her again, and extremely nervously told her to forget it, while placing a hand on his chest to try to calm his wildly beating heart and ordering himself to calm down. He muttered to himself in surprise, describing her as shameless for her indifference, while wondering what kind of improper thoughts he was having about a noble lady. Meanwhile, Margaret was facing a real dilemma, struggling to reach the buttons on the back of her dress, but her hands couldn't reach. She turned to Enoch and asked him for help to undo the knot or buttons she couldn't reach. Enoch's face turned red from embarrassment and shock, and he asked her in a trembling voice what she had just said, unable to believe the request she had made of him. Margaret clearly repeated her request for him to undo the buttons, internally admitting that the situation was also awkward for her. She explained to him with a serious expression, trembling from the effort, that she had no choice but to take off her dress, because if she went into the water with it on, or if it got ruined, she would have no other clothes to wear later. Enoch covered his own eyes, trying to escape the situation, while Margaret pleaded with him for help in a soft voice. In the end, Enoch yielded to her request. He approached her slowly and extremely nervously, his trembling fingers beginning to undo the buttons of her dress one by one, while a heavy and tense silence spread between them. Standing behind her, Enoch suddenly asked Margaret what the first thing she wanted to do was once she was able to leave this island. She was surprised by his sudden question, so she thought for a moment before answering that. First, she wanted to take a bath with soap, and then she hoped to have a luxurious and proper formal dinner. She sketched out in her memory the image of the last formal dinner she had at the Floyant family mansion, where the table was laden with steak, lobster, and delicacies. She realized deep down that the person who had actually eaten that food was not her, but the original owner, Margaret. But now Margaret's memories had become an inseparable part of her own. She admitted to herself that no matter how delicious the food in this world was, and no matter what luxurious and shiny jewelry she could wear, she still missed her original home, where she was born and raised in Korea. She sadly recalled her past life. Although she was an orphan, had no friends, and no one waiting for her to come home, homesickness still pulled at her. She snapped out of her daydream and asked Enoch the same question, asking what his first wish would be after getting out. He hesitantly replied that he wasn't sure. Margaret was annoyed by his vague answer, waving her fist in the air and muttering and blaming him for his coldness, while she had answered with complete seriousness. So Enoch quietly told her not to get worked up. He gently took her hand and whispered to her that if he answered honestly what was on his mind, it would put her in a difficult and awkward situation. Margaret stammered, wondering what he meant, when suddenly Enoch poked her bare back with his finger, startling her and making her jump. He explained with a hint of a smile that he had finished unbuttoning a while ago, but she had just been standing there motionless. Margaret's face burned with shame. She yelled at him, saying he should have told her instead of staying silent, wondering internally when he had become so sly. Enoch raised his hands in surrender with a charming smile and apologized softly to her, while she thought in surprise that this behavior was not at all like the serious Enoch she knew. Margaret quickly ran towards the water and yelled at him, flatly warning him not to look back while she undressed and got in the water. She thought with a racing heart that his personality had really changed. She immersed her body in the cool stream water, feeling refreshment and comfort seep into her limbs. She enjoyed swimming for a moment, but reminded herself that she had to finish exploring and return before sunset, so she decided to get out now. She looked around for her clothes, only to find something strange. Her dress was not where she had left it. She asked loudly if Enoch knew where she had put her dress, and he replied, still with his back to her, that he didn't know why she was asking him about a dress she had taken off herself. Margaret sank into the water up to her nose, realizing in horror that her dress was completely gone. Suddenly, Enoch stopped moving, and his body language changed, causing Margaret to worry, and she stammered for him not to turn around. But Enoch seemed tense and didn't answer her, so she wondered what was happening, noticing him staring sharply into the forest and wondering if someone else was present. Enoch stared at the dense trees, muttering inaudible words, while Margaret heard the sound of rustling trees. Enoch's eyes gleamed sharply as he gripped the wooden stick tightly and told Margaret to wait right there for a moment, as he was going to search the area first. Enoch left cautiously, leaving Margaret alone in the water, feeling scared and confused, and cursing the mysterious situation. Enoch ventured into the forest, tracking the suspicious movement he had noticed. Suddenly, he lunged with lightning speed and professional combat moves at a person hiding in the bushes, pinning him to the ground with the tip of his wooden spear. Enoch looked coldly at the man in a knight's uniform, sarcastically said that there were many faces on this island he hadn't seen in a long time, and addressed the man as Sir Diego. Diego smiled nervously while being pointed at, apologizing for making His Highness wait. The man lying on the ground asked in surprise about the meaning of this ambush, so Enoch coldly replied while pressing down on him with a spear that this was a question he should be asking. Enoch recognized the man's identity, pointing out that he was the commander of the Imperial Guard, and asked in surprise how he could be on this island when he should be in the Empire. Commander Diego explained in a pained voice that he had suddenly lost consciousness during training, and when he opened his eyes, he found himself lying on a riverbank, confirming that he had absolutely no idea what had happened. Enoch removed the spear from him, so Diego stood up, dusted off his clothes, and thanked His Highness for his mercy. Diego also asked Enoch how he had come to be here, so Enoch replied that it was the same for him. He was working in the Imperial Palace, and the next moment he found himself waking up here. Enoch gravely asked Diego if he had found any clues about a distress signal, but Diego regretfully denied it, explaining that their current situation made it impossible to send any signals at all. Diego added the important information that there were 2 other people in his group who had also met the same mysterious fate, which piqued Enoch's interest, who wanted to know the identity of this group. Diego revealed that his companions were Crown Prince Arthdal of the Hestia Kingdom and Bishop Ruzef, noting that they had all woken up under similar circumstances. Enoch laughed with bitter irony, thinking to himself what a very strange coincidence it was to gather key figures from the Langrid Empire and the Hestia Kingdom in one place. He had initially thought it was a conspiracy orchestrated by the Rodband faction to target him personally, but considering the identities of the people gathered here, it seemed to be something much bigger than that. Enoch secretly pondered who the mastermind was, but quickly cut off these thoughts to focus on a more important and pressing issue, casting a sharp gaze at Diego. He asked a strange and sudden question, whether anyone among his companions needed to wear women's clothing. This shocked Diego, who was baffled by the nature of the question. Diego argued that the situation was urgent and that someone in his group was in desperate need of those clothes. However, Enoch thought in confusion that it didn't seem like something Crown Prince Arthdal or the bishop would need. Diego, breaking out in a sweat, nervously asked if Enoch was accusing him of doing something shameful. Enoch's gaze grew sharper and more furious, making Diego sense danger. Enoch pointed his spear at Diego's neck, threateningly ordering him to answer the question correctly and without evasion. Diego raised his hands in surrender out of fear, assuring His Highness that he was a knight of the Empire, not his enemy. Enoch revealed a terrifying smile, telling him he should have given that excuse before stealing his companion's clothes, and clarified the reason for his anger. Diego dropped another bombshell, revealing that Johanna Lucy was also in his group, which shocked Enoch into silence. Enoch repeated the name in surprise, unable to believe that the Saintess was also here. The image of the Saintess, the first to appear in the Empire in 100 years with unique divine power, surfaced in his mind. Enoch laughed with dark irony, commenting that the fact that even the Saintess was not spared from this disaster and was stranded on a deserted island proved to him that God did not exist. Diego stammered, trying to connect the events, and asked if that woman had no clothes to wear. Enoch explained. He sternly pointed out that the dress Diego had stolen was his companion's only piece of clothing. He cornered him with logic, saying that unless the Saintess with him was naked and needed covering, there was absolutely no reason for him to steal such a thing. Enoch noticed Diego's silence and confusion and cleverly deduced that since he had nothing to say, it meant the Saintess was indeed clothed, which meant he had stolen the dress merely as a spare. He held out his hand and ordered him to return the dress immediately, whereupon Diego shamefully took out the hidden dress and handed it to him. Enoch took the dress, instructed Diego to meet at this location every 10 days, and demanded that he give advance notice if he had to move to a distant place. Diego asked if he was to do this without his companion's knowledge and proposed that he join them, but Enoch turned his back. Enoch left coldly, giving Diego a final warning that he had told him to only answer the questions asked, implicitly rejecting his offer. Diego bowed respectfully and submissively, declaring complete obedience to the orders he had just received. Enoch gave him clear instructions that he must contact him immediately upon finding any means of escaping the deserted island, while emphasizing in a harsh tone that he must stay completely out of his companion's sight and not go near her. Enoch added with a cold warning that if Diego became a nuisance to them, he would show no tolerance or mercy. The commander then nodded in understanding and agreed to these conditions without objection. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the water, hugging her body as she shivered violently, telling herself in terror that she would freeze to death if she stayed in the open any longer. She wondered angrily and confusedly how far Enoch had gone, inwardly cursing the perverted thief who had stolen her dress, thankful that she hadn't taken off her underwear, or the disaster would have been much greater. Margaret sneezed loudly, feeling a biting cold seep into her bones, and sadly realized that catching a cold was inevitable under these harsh conditions. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke the silence of the forest, calling her name, as she quickly turned her head to glimpse Enoch running toward her, eagerly getting up to call out to him. Enoch arrived out of breath, holding her dress in his hand, his eyes showing extreme concern as he asked if she was all right and sincerely apologized for being late. Seeing the dress, her face lit up, and she let out a huge cheer because he had found it, quickly running toward him to get out of the icy water. She felt immense relief that the crisis was finally over, but suddenly a severe wave of dizziness hit her, making her feel lightheaded as her vision blurred completely. Her body lost its balance, and she fell heavily into the water with a loud splash, while Enoch screamed her name in a panic and rushed toward her to try and catch her. As she floated on the surface of the water with her eyes rolled back, she scoffed at her own physical weakness, describing herself as being truly as fragile as a glass fish.